Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Friday, May 24th, 2024. Well, a couple of 24s in there, so you know what to do. Get to the lottery office and lose your money, essentially. All right, 2024, time for another year. I'm sick of 2024 already. We're almost halfway through at this point. But yes, time for another show, time for another weekend look ahead. I don't know. What the hell is it? What do we do with Fridays? Oh, yes, right. We read you some of the longer stories that we've been holding on to, and update you on information you'll need to have, I guess, a Memorial Day conversation over the long weekend. I haven't really given real thought to what are we actually doing, but come Memorial Day, Greg and I usually signal to one another, maybe we ought to take Monday off and just we'll take that extra day, we'll relax, we'll honor our fallen. We'll go to linen sales, possibly get a discount on a Chevrolet, something like that, what we usually do for Memorial Day. And actually this Tuesday, and next Tuesday, I guess, Joan McCarter won't be here. I wonder if I could give Greg the chance to make good on Tuesday so that he doesn't go too crazy waiting for Wednesday. All right, well, I'll have to discuss it with him off the air and then figure out what we're going to do for Monday, because Monday will still happen regardless. So, and there's so many things that we should be sharing with you and discussing with you that it's hard to give up any one opportunity to do that. All right, let's see. As a matter of fact, we should check in as Justice Putnam gives us the thumbs up and tells us everything seems to be working just fine. What's on Justice's mind today? Ah, yes, right. The Trump rally in the Bronx. I did grab a couple of stories about that. And let's see. Trump mobbed up Russian money launderer. What? That's not news. Come on. All right. Oh, something about that stricken from the congressional record. I missed that story. Oh, that's procedural. Let's have that story. If you're hanging around and just making sure that I know that you said that everything was okay, then perhaps you can send that story along. Or perhaps I will trip over it over the next 2 hours as people throw it in front of my face via social media. That could always happen. All right, let's coordinate. Oh, and let's remember to do our morning reposts of Mighty OCD's. Notice to everyone on social media that we are live. I try and do that every day, and every day I find that I forget to look back at the social media pages until about 9:20, and then it's like, well, all right. Yeah, but there's still plenty of show left, but I'm trying to remember to do that first thing in the morning. Okay, so here's what is occupying social media space, news space, plus a couple of other things that have been held over for a couple of days that occupied space the other day that I didn't get to. Today, oh, and thanks, Justice is listening. Good morning, Justice. How you doing? And he's sent along the story. Now I'm just sort of interested. A Democrat listed Trump's trials on the House floor, and apparently that's against the rules, according to Republicans in the House. And, of course, they run things. Occasionally, they actually muster a majority on the floor. Let's see what happened here. Yeah, Jim McGovern. He's good at needling Republicans on this. A Democrat listed Trump's trials on the House floor. His words were struck from the record. It is ordinarily against the rules to disparage any other member of the House or members of the other body, as they like to refer to the Senate. They don't like to talk. I don't know why they don't like to say the word Senate on there, but I guess it's like calling the Super Bowl the Super Bowl. And also against the rules to disparage the president to a certain extent. I mean, he's going to come in for some criticism, but personal insults, generally speaking. But of course, Donald Trump isn't the president. But generally speaking, they don't really want you making personal insults about anybody on the floor. We'll see what they used to as a news hook for this stunt and story. Mariana Alfaro and Jacob Bogage. I don't know how he pronounces it. This is a pronunciation day for me. I don't know how anything is pronounced. Well, I never do, but today I'm hit by several such stories. A Democrat listed Trump's trials on the House floor. His words were struck from the record. Maybe they want to distract from the fact that their candidate for president has been indicted more times than he's been elected. Representative Jim McGovern, see, he is good at this, of Massachusetts, thanks Massachusetts, said of his Republican colleagues. So House was brought to a halt for over half an hour. That does tend to happen when you start with taking words down. Brought to a halt for over half an hour on Wednesday after Republicans demanded that the words of Jim McGovern be taken down from the congressional record after McGovern, during floor remarks, listed the number of criminal trials former President Donald Trump faces. I mean, that's just basic fact, but Republicans using their bare majority to screw around with, facts, which is kind of par for the course for these guys. As House members were debating a procedural move on digital cryptocurrency legislation, McGovern, top Democrat on the House Rules Committee, he does know the rules, accused House Republicans of pandering to the most extreme members of their party, they do that, and blocking bipartisan collaboration. They do that as well. This, he said, is a stunning indictment of their ability to get anything done. Then McGovern tore into Trump. Speaking of indictments, all right, so he just went wandering a little bit. Republicans are skipping their real jobs to take day trips to New York to try to undermine Trump's criminal trial. That, too, is happening. We've noted it here on the show. This, he said, of course, referencing the times that House Republicans have skipped votes, which they can ill afford to do, I would add, to support Trump at his Manhattan criminal trial, where he faces charges in connection with alleged hush money payments made to an adult film actress, although we've discussed other ways of framing the issues at the trial as well. McGovern accused Republicans of having no time to work with Democrats, but plenty of time to put on weird matching cult uniforms and stand behind President Trump with the bright red ties like pathetic props. And McGovern's a little bit online with the rest of us. I like it. Maybe they want to distract from the fact that their candidate for president has been indicted more times than he's been elected, McGovern said. Maybe they don't want to talk about the fact that the leader of their party is on trial for covering up hush money payments to a porn star for political gain, not to mention 3 other criminal felony prosecutions he's facing. Well, they don't want to talk about that. That's clear. But it is true. And it's also true that they don't want to talk about it. Let's see. Jerry Carl, a Republican of Alabama, was presiding over the House floor and reminded members that they should refrain from attacks directed toward presumed nominees for the office of the president. Which I don't know. Maybe that is actually included in the rules. I'm not 100% certain. McGovern argued that he shouldn't be admonished for stating the simple fact that the former president was indicted by a grand jury and is on trial in a court of law. That's not my opinion. It's just the truth, McGovern said. The congressman then asked Carl if it's unparliamentary to state a fact on the House floor. The chair is not in a position to determine the veracity of remarks made on the floor. Carl said they handed him that one. McGovern doubled down, noting that last week a Republican House member called the Trump trial a sham on the House floor without being admonished. So disparaging a whole other branch of government, although it was a state trial. But anyway, McGovern then wondered why he was being admonished when that colleague was not. Carl said he would not offer an opinion. Didn't know. There was no such opinion. McGovern then pulled out a House rule book. He does have one, and asked if his admonishment was based on a principle in Jefferson's manual that says in Parliament to speak irreverently or seditiously against the king is against order. Is that what this is about? McGovern challenged. Once again, Carl said McGovern could not engage in personality attacks in debates in accordance with a rule in the House rule book. So it is, in fact, based on Jefferson's manual, McGovern concluded. Donald Trump might want to be a king, but he's not a king. He's not a presumptive king. He's not even the president. The House's manual does forbid abuse, innuendo, or ridicule of the president, during debate, derivative of centuries-old British parliamentary procedure, and extends the policy to presumptive major party nominees for president. So it does do that? Okay, great. I know you're trying to do your job and follow precedent, McGovern told Carl, but frankly, at some point, it's time for this body to recognize that there is no precedent for this situation. Also a good idea to remind everybody. We have a presumptive nominee for president facing, wink, wink, 88 felony counts, and we're being prevented from even acknowledging it. McGovern then summarized the trials Trump faces. He really wanted to get in trouble for this. The Manhattan one, 2 separate ones in connection with his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Then he's not on trial here, but remember, we were reminded yesterday that also in Manhattan, the campaign is in trouble, being sued for creating a hostile work environment, sexual harassment, etc. But McGovern was also noting, let's see, separate ones in connection with his efforts to overturn the 2020 election, a federal one about classified documents found at his Pervalago sex dungeon in Florida. It's too bad he didn't name it that way. He also noted that a jury in a civil trial has already found Trump liable for sexually abusing and defaming E. Jean Carroll. As McGovern continued through Trump's legal woes, Representative Aaron Houchin of you. Say Houchin. People from Indiana, you want to chime in on that one? Take down his words, she said. Mr. Speaker, I demand that his words be taken down. The general from Massachusetts will now be seated, Carl ordered McGovern. That will happen regardless of whether there's any merit to taking the words down. This is the procedure, stand and say, I demand that the gentleman's words be taken down, which, by the way, doesn't actually, I don't think, actually refers to taking them out of the congressional record, which does happen if the vote on it is sustained. But taken down actually, I think, is actually referring to, I want the floor reporter who records the session and takes dictation essentially of the session. There are floor reporters that prepare this stuff for the congressional record. Actually is supposed to separate those words out, and then they're taken down on a note card and read back to you, and then everybody decides whether or not they ought to be withdrawn or otherwise deleted from the record. So, the House then comes to an abrupt pause as the House parliamentarian, staff, and Carl figured out whether McGovern's words broke any rules that would merit having them struck from the record. They don't figure it out. They make a recommendation, and then the House figures it out. Clerks rifled through a transcript of McGovern's remarks as members of the Rules Committee crowded around the Democratic and Republican workstations. McGovern, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, sporting a large smirk. Why not? Across the chamber, Houchin leaned forward in her chair and covered herself with a large white shawl. Very interesting. So she was clearly Jewish and praying. I wonder what she was doing over there. A little over an hour later, Carl returned to the rostrum. It took a while. The chair is prepared to rule, after an hour of consultation with the parliamentarian. He said in a slow southern drawl, I didn't realize that he had a slow southern drawl, he would be striking down McGovern's words. The Democrat stared back at him with his hands in the air, then rolled his eyes at the decision. Carl cited the archaic House rule McGovern had referenced earlier that prohibits House members from criticizing the king, which we don't have. Carl argued that, per that rule, House members in the chamber can't accuse a presidential nominee of engaging in illegal activities, even if that nominee has been legally charged. Interesting. This is warranted even though a candidate may not have officially obtained the party's nomination, once there is no reasonable dispute that the candidate will receive the nomination. Carl said, well, I dispute it. Why not? First of all, I think there's a pretty good chance that he'll die before he gets it. And second of all, why not? Yes, I absolutely do dispute it. I mean, look, the guy forged electoral college certificates. He's disputing everything under the sun. He's disputing that Biden won certain states. I think everything's open to dispute at this point. I don't see that he's the nominee, and I don't see that there's no reasonable dispute that he'll receive the nomination. I dispute it right now, and I'm very reasonable. The Republican added that while the House rules allow for criticism of a candidate's official positions, and mind you, Trump's defense to almost all of these charges is that they were, in fact, official acts, and so therefore he has immunity from them. This was his idea, not mine. Why not say that, right? This allows for criticism of the candidate's official positions. Well, he's pleading in court that these are his official positions. He's losing constantly, but he is pleading that. Well, anyway, Carl goes on to say it's a breach of order to refer to a candidate in terms that are personally offensive. McGovern, thus, was blocked from speaking on the House floor for the rest of the day. That's the penalty for having your words taken down. There's sometimes a vote in which people appeal the ruling of the chair or something like that. But I guess it is the fact that the chair makes the ruling in consultation with the parliamentarian, and then there's a vote, if you wish, on upholding or overruling the ruling of the chair. If you want to waste time on that. In a post shared on Twitter, McGovern said he was silenced for listing the multiple charges Trump faces. This is a good and interesting procedural story. Thanks, Justice. Apparently, Republicans are allowed to say that Trump's trial is a sham. and the judge is corrupt and the jury is rigged, McGovern said, but it is against the rules for me to even acknowledge that the trials exist. House Democrats have, over the past week, been critical of their colleagues who have taken time off from Congress and flocked to Manhattan to show solidarity with Trump. Even House Speaker Mike Johnson, an advocate of conservative Christian morals. That's a nice sales pitch for him. And throw it right into the story. Visited the courthouse last week, calling the hush money payment to trial a travesty and a partisan witch hunt. Of course, but, let me just say, porn. Mike Johnson went to New York for a porn thing. That's all I heard. Johnson doubled down on these criticisms at Wednesday's news conference, calling the Manhattan case patently absurd. I don't know if he said patently or patently. And without evidence, accused several prosecutors in the Trump case, as well as the Justice Department, of colluding against the former president. He didn't do it on the House floor, though. They are clearly going after President Trump because of who he is. Well, that's true. He's a criminal. They have him tied up for weeks in a courthouse when he should be out. Have the ability to speak freely. He does do that. And to campaign. He had a rally yesterday. And to be around the country. And I mean, when that guy's around the country, he sits around the country. You know what I'm saying? Okay. Well, quite a story. Wasn't expecting to spend that time there, but I like that one. Good pick, Justice. There's more. So he did have a rally yesterday. For some reason in the Bronx. I have coverage from it from NewYork1.com, which I guess was Johnny on the spot there, but also Philip Bump, I guess, decided to go and attend the rally, and he had his own observations on it. Let me see if I can't take a sampling from both here. Spectrum News, New York One, tells us what? Who's writing here? Atlan Hassard, or Hassard, Hassard, don't know how it's pronounced. Don't know about anything's pronunciation today. Trump draws large crowd at rally in the Bronx, and I think they mean the number of people who attended, even though it was in New York. There are such people in New York, and of course, they can drive in, be bussed in from wherever. Not the biggest rally I've ever seen, but, and the people there aren't, in the photo that's illustrating the piece, not particularly large themselves either, so they must be talking about the size of the crowd. A rally for former President Donald Trump drew a large crowd at, another place I don't know how to pronounce, Crotona Park, Crotona. Tell me about it, Bronx. That happened Thursday night. New York One reporters on the scene said the turnout was, quote, in the thousands, which of course means that Trump will claim that it was in the trillions. Let's see. Is this, he had the rally. All right. Well, they put it in the maybe we'll just read Philip Bump on this thing because they're going to give a factual rundown. All right. We'll go see what they have to say. Trump in 2020, of course, won by only 16% of the vote in the borough, which is considered a Democratic stronghold. Nevertheless, Trump in this city for his criminal hush money trial in Manhattan used a recess in the trial to campaign for support in his presidential bid. In his speech, Trump criticized the current state of the city. Now, of course, let's see. Sadly, this is a city in decline. Throughout my life, I've seen New York through good times and bad, through boom times and crime waves like my own, through market crashes and terrorist attacks, but I've never seen it quite like this. It's like nothing anybody's ever seen. I didn't even go in that far, but let's see. Okay, he'll make New York great again. Listed his local real estate projects. All right. Well, at this point, yeah, I'll just note that, okay, yeah, they did do it. I'll share the article with you. It's, I thought maybe Philip Bump's coverage of it would be more up our alley here for whatever reason. He goes, or they give him the headline in the Washington Post. Even Donald Trump has trouble getting New York's attention. The former president came to the Bronx on Thursday night for an unusual campaign rally. The Bronx didn't take much notice. Drawing a crowd of thousands in the Bronx is like, that's just, there's 1,000 people on the street, so I'm not so certain it means that much. But New York One kind of went with it. Well, he drew a crowd. Bump is going to play down the crowd, and I prefer that. You could hear Donald Trump sporadically through the trees. Crotona, I think, Park has a number of rocky hills, and the former president was speaking on top of one as I was talking to retired teacher Pam Sporn, not porn, like the porn star for whom He provided hush money and is now on trial in New York. But sporn, that's a spoon and a fork and porn all combined into one thing. Pam Sporn, 67, on top of one of maybe 100 yards away, one of the Rocky Hills. Sporn was carrying a sign written on cardboard, "Trump out of our borough." So Sporn was there to protest him. Even the porn stars don't like him. Sporn stars don't like him. Nobody likes him. I think it's very disrespectful for Trump to come to this particular area of the Bronx, she said. When asked why she came to the park during the rally, "I don't want him anywhere in the Bronx because he's a racist and a xenophobe. This particular neighborhood is very much an immigrant." And then she is interrupted by a young man who was wearing a T-shirt featuring Pepe the Frog, the cartoon character adopted as a sort of right-wing mascot during the 2016 election campaign. He's very online, but 10 years ago. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, "is there a Trump rally near here?" "Go down that way," one of the men with Sporn offered, pointing down a path where a number of people were listening to Trump outside the security area. "Okay, thank you," the young man said. "God bless you." I see. Trying to... feels like an ironic "God bless you" from a Pepe the Frog guy. Then, when he was a few yards down the path, he yelled back, "Go Trump!" "You'll get your ass kicked that way," another man with Sporn replied. "I like Trump," said the young man, who is white, it is noted here. Sporn tried to continue her response. "The people who live in this neighborhood, you're doing that intentionally," one of the men with her, both of them black, shouted at the young man. So it's difficult to get the words out here. "The people who live in this neighborhood," Sporn said, "are primarily African American and immigrants from Africa, from Honduras." "He's so dumb," one of the men interjected before suddenly turning furious. "Yo, don't even do that because that really will get your ass kicked." Apparently they're all distracted by the guy in the T-shirt. Sporn gamely went on, "There are countries that Trump has called S-hole countries." You know how he says that. But here it does say S-hole. That's nice. But her companion made clear why things had suddenly escalated. "Why are you doing the Nazi sign?" he called after the kid. "God bless you. The God bless you kid." He turned to me. "You see, this is what that man promotes," he says, referring to Trump. "The kind of hate he spews," Sporn added. "It's not something that helps our community." This encounter was a fitting microcosm of Trump's visit. The young man was clearly trying to get a rise out of Sporn and her companions, and it worked. By dropping into the middle of a predominantly black and Hispanic community in the Bronx, Trump was, among other things, doing the same thing, trolling the left and his critics. He hoped to get a rise out of his opponents, and he did, at least among those who noticed he was there. The rally had a footprint in the neighborhood, but a modest one. Despite the insistence of some Trump allies, the Bronx rally wasn't huge. I'm sure some Trump allies said it was. I guess it's linked here. The hilltop where he spoke allowed for people to spread around the podium on all sides, about 40 people deep, though it rarely extended that far. It was a small club performance, by design, not an arena show. It was, however, much more diverse than any Trump rally I've attended. His audiences tend, like his voting base, to skew heavily white. This rally had a disproportionate number of Black, Asian, and Hispanic attendees, reflecting the surrounding community. Many of those in attendance were, in fact, from the Bronx. Others were from other places near New York City, Westchester County to the north, or out on Long Island. An older woman who called herself Miss M had stopped to rest as she climbed the hill to the rally site. Miss M, who is black, told me that she felt it was important to come because "I feel like women of color are getting a bum rap." Well, it does happen. "Not every woman of color is stupid," she said. Okay, well, yowza. Suggesting that those who didn't support Trump were. Oh, well, she liked him, she said, because he, quote, "has great knowledge." Well, I disagree. "And he's strong," her daughter added, with which Miss M agreed. I mean, I don't know what you're looking at, but okay. She noted that her daughter was in that age group that somehow has slipped, young people who lean left instead of right. Her daughter, like a number of rally attendees, brought her dog, a Maltese/Yorkie, a Morkie named Sugar. Should introduce her to Sporn over there. Anyway, there were a number of families with kids there. Melinda Ramirez, 44, came with her 3 sons from their home nearby. She said that she had not voted for Trump in 2016, but did when he was up for re-election. "I had no idea what was going on, even about him. But 2020, COVID woke all of us up," she said. Okay. Not enough to see who was doing a good job with it and who was terrible, but okay. Ramirez lost her job and was frustrated by school closures, so she started to pay attention to politics. And that just made me want to say, okay, what's going on now? I've got to watch the news. What are they going to do? And then I just started seeing the hatred for him, and I was like, what's going on? Well, he's telling you to drink bleach and use hydroxychloroquine. That was what's going on. She was excited to see Trump, but not as excited as her 8-year-old son Ryan, who showed up in a Flash t-shirt. I asked what he wanted to hear Trump say. He quietly replied, I like you. Okay. In the background, one of the warm-up speakers, Representative Byron Donalds, why did he get to speak there? Holy mackerel. Was leading the crowd in a Let's Go Brandon chant. A 7-year-old named Connor was listening to this. So everybody brought their 8-year-old, 7-year-olds, and then they're going with the Let's Go Brandon chant. Wink. Anyway, Connor was sitting on his dad's shoulders on the other side of the rally wearing a camouflage Make America Great Again hat with some encouragement from his family. How'd they even see it? It must have blended into the trees, and you look like your top of your head is missing. Make America Great Again hat. Let's see. With some encouragement from his family, he told me about his tribute to the former president. I weared my Trump outfit I had an event, he said, about one day at school. And then we had to learn. We talked about how the people we dressed up as, about them. Well, he's 7, give him a break. That's fine. Well spoken for a 7-year-old, I think. Let's see. It was President's Month and Black History Month, and he chose himself that he wanted to be Trump. Kira O'Connor, 27, explained. And he made he wore a suit and was very respectful. He didn't mock him by wearing a wig or anything. O'Connor and her family were there like many attendees because they had family who worked in law enforcement. Some attendees posed for selfies with the numerous police officers on the scene. You get the idea? All right. Well, I think we've had about enough of this, but interesting alternative view offered by Philip Boehm. Thanks, Phil.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Okay, let's see. There's so many more things. I got to move on to a couple other things and share some longer reads with you. One thing I want to throw in there is another piece of information about the weird pine air freshener flag that was found outside of Alito's beach house, the Appeal to Heaven pine tree flag. Just a little bit more on that from rightwingwatch.org that gives us a little additional information both about the people who are using the flag. Greg mentioned that, and this sort of piqued my interest, that Mike Johnson apparently flies the Appeal to Heaven flag outside of his congressional offices, which now speaks to it being a more widely shared symbol than I thought. I mean, I knew of its historic use, and I know sometimes people just like those weird historical relics, but now it turns out it's a real thing. I mean, it's almost Pepe the Frog-ish in a way. It's not a cartoon, of course, but it's definitely shared widely with a purpose and with a wink when they do it. And Peter Montgomery reports for Right Wing Watch on this fact. And apparently, does he mention it? I don't know. I assume it's in here somewhere, but I happened to see also that people reported it also flies on the flagpole outside of Leonard Leo's home. Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society, who has had such a huge influence in Trumpifying and Republicanizing the federal judiciary from top to bottom. So here's the deal, as Peter Montgomery puts it, Dominionists' battle flag, it's a Dominionist battle flag in their view, flown over Justice Alito's beach house. The New York Times reported on Wednesday that an Appeal to Heaven flag was flown over Justice Samuel Alito's beach house last summer, like the upside-down American flag flown at Alito's home in the days following the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The Appeal to Heaven flag was carried by insurrectionists who believed that fighting to keep Donald Trump in office was a righteous cause. For those of you listening, I just wanted to let you know it was not a righteous cause. Every time we bring this stuff up, YouTube labels or hangs a tag on my podcast as though I were spreading January 6th conspiracy theories. And of course, what we're reporting is that stuff is so dumb, you should never believe that kind of garbage. But, the YouTube algorithm doesn't understand these things. It's not AI. It's I don't know. It's artificially stupid, but, runs the world these days. The flag, back to the story, featuring an evergreen tree, that's why it's called the pine tree flag, and the words Appeal to Heaven, why it's sometimes called the Appeal to Heaven flag, right, was used by some patriots in the Revolutionary War who didn't know we had this other flag. They never heard of Betsy Ross. Can you believe it? Back then they didn't have the internet, so. Anyway, in recent years, it has become what religious right expert Frederick Clarkson, there he is, calls the battle flag of the New Apostolic Reformation. Very specific. A symbol of Dominionists who rallied around Trump's presidency in his efforts to stay in office after losing the 2020 election. You don't appeal to heaven about that. That guy's a pervert. Anyway, House Speaker Mike Johnson has also drawn criticism for displaying the flag outside his office. There's that fact. NAR Apostle Dutch Sheets. I am not sure whether that's a nickname, Dutch. And then it's funny. The picture illustrating the piece has this person, Dutch Sheets, holding up this flag. Now, it's a white background flag, and he's holding it up, by the corners, and it says New Apostolic Reformation Apostle, and that's in quotes, Apostle. Dutch Sheets made the Appeal to Heaven flag a Dominionist banner. So I guess he's responsible for pushing people to adopt this thing. But I'd never heard of him. And as I'm reading the thing, I'm seeing Dutch Sheets, and he's holding this thing like like linens. I don't know the guy. I don't know. I never heard this name before. And it looks like a sheet that they've painted a pine tree on and turned into a flag. But that's not it. The guy's name is Sheets. Now, like the gas station with a Z at the end. Dutch Sheets. Like, is this really what people use on their beds in Holland? Is that what's going on? What do you mean Dutch Sheets? That's the guy's name. I don't know. Sounds fake. Anyway, where the hell are we on this one? Oh, let's go back to the first mention of Dutch Sheets. Okay, NAR Apostle Dutch Sheets has been promoting the flag since 2013. So he feels like he's done a lot of work on this, and it's now coming to fruition. You know how it is with people's long-term projects. In 2014, Right Wing Watch reported that Sheets and anti-choice activist Janet Porter were invoking the flag to support her abortion-banning heartbeat bill. In a video at the time, Sheets says of the flag, "This is the banner we were born under." It is not, but that's what he says. He believes all sorts of weird things. Sheets preaches that the church, or ecclesia, which is, the Greek word for it? Ekklesia, is meant to be God's governing force on the earth, even though no one has ever heard that word, except for weirdos like me. And of course, is it Greek? Because it's also, the Spanish word is iglesia, so it's clearly derived from that. So maybe it makes you think, well, Romance language, right? Spanish. So maybe is it Latin? I don't know, but it looks like it's Greek to me. But it's all Greek to me. So, I walked right into that one. Does anyone care? Does anyone want to know? Does anyone want me to look it up? Greek. Done. Okay. Now back to the story. Phew. Okay. Well, at any rate, Sheets preaches that the ecclesia is meant to be God's governing force on earth, promoting a 2018 gathering at Trump's hotel in Washington, D.C. called The Turnaround an appeal to heaven, Sheets declared the church, capitalized, is about to move into a completely new level of enforcing kingdom rule and the will of God on earth. They've got all sorts of strange, lexicon that the rest of us don't know anything about that is signals to one another. During Trump's term in office, Sheets was intensely focused on the Supreme Court. That does happen. Praying that God would create multiple vacancies for Trump to fill, which is, of course, praying for people's deaths. Thank you very much. Like other religious right figures, Sheets promotes false Christian nationalist narratives about history and the U.S. founding, which takes on an added importance at a time when right-wing Supreme Court justices have used historical practices and understandings, and that's enclosed in scare quotes, a historical practices and understandings test to undermine church-state separation. And there was big news on that front, not necessarily church-state, but weirdo ahistorical interpretations of everything that came out in a big decision that we have not yet discussed on today's program. But Sheets was extremely active in the religious right wing of the Stop the Steal movement to help Trump stay in power, insisting that God did not want Joe Biden to be president. And yet, it happened. As Biden's popular and electoral victory margins grew in the weeks after the election, Sheets declared, "We are in the middle of an evil attempt to overthrow the government of the United States of America." Well, that part was true. He was pointing in the wrong direction. Adding on a hopeful note, "We still have time to see the rod of Christ's authority fall and crush the rebellion at the gate." Why would it fall? I don't know. Somehow falling is a good thing for these guys. And, whatever. They speak in pseudo-biblical weirdo language. People for the American Way, which had already called on Alito to recuse himself from cases related to the January 6th insurrection, released a statement from President Svante Myrick saying the news about the appeal to heaven flag calls into question his ability to be impartial, not just in cases related to the January 6th insurrection, but on a range of other issues as well. Okay. So just a quick primer on that and putting the new apostolic Reformation weirdos and one Dutch Sheets on your radar. So again, this article doesn't mention anywhere the Leonard Leo connection, but we'll see if we can't, I'll make a note to see if we can pick up a reference, a link on that one, just to show you that we didn't make it up. Although, could have made up much worse, I'm sure. All right, let's see. So speaking of the Supreme Court and of Alito, yes, the big story yesterday covered everywhere, but I happened to grab, both Election Law blog and why not go this way? Stephen Wolfe writing at Daily Kos on the then breaking news of the Supreme Court's decision on gerrymandering issues. Supreme Court protecting Republican gerrymanders by sabotaging black voters' rights. It's got to be one or the other. They're going to be in opposition at all times. Black voters' rights and the Republican Party and their gerrymandering, they're not going to get along. The Supreme Court's right-wing majority upheld South Carolina's congressional map in a 6-3 decision along ideological lines, of course, issued yesterday, reversing a lower court ruling that found Republicans had violated the Constitution by racially gerrymandering the 1st District to protect Nancy Mace, a white Republican, and boy, oh boy, is she white. The majority ruled that politics, not race, was the predominant factor in the GOPS gerrymander, which shifted black voters from the 1st District over to the neighboring 6th to ensure that conservative white voters would still dominate in the 1st. This latest decision all but eliminates one of the few remaining tools that voters of color had left to challenge racism in redistricting. Because the court's Republican-appointed majority ruled in 2019 that federal courts cannot adjudicate partisan gerrymandering challenges, allowing Republican map makers to claim partisan motives as a defense against racial... why isn't the rest of this story loading? All right, we're going to have to reload the page here. Oh, boy, everything's frozen. Okay. Well, that's not a great way to start off the day. Let's see if we can't open this up again from, I don't know, we'll take a different angle on it and try to get through to the same story. And, or we can continue on from the pocket version, I guess. Let's see. Because the court's Republican-appointed majority ruled in 2019 the federal courts cannot adjudicate partisan gerrymandering challenges, allowing Republican map makers to claim partisan motives as a defense against racial gerrymandering only entrenches both kinds of gerrymanders. The election law blog article that I grabbed on it basically explains it this way. Well, long story short, this one. They decided, I guess, back in 2019 and reinforced yesterday that if you're gerrymandering purely for partisan political reasons to give the Republican Party, let's just say hypothetically, an electoral advantage and maybe overrepresent them in the House of Representatives and therefore skew things horribly in the wrong direction forever and ever and ever, that is okay. That is to say, it's a political decision, and they sort of lean on the political question doctrine to say that's not something that the courts will intervene in. Now, they say this knowing full well, of course, that the reason there even is partisan gerrymandering at all is, well, not necessarily from the very beginning, but modern era gerrymandering is all about trying to hold down the minority vote and the Democratic vote. And it overlaps. They say if we either shift black voters from one district to another or whatever, then we'll basically be making the assumption that they vote so heavily Democratic that we'll get a partisan outcome. So now basically what they said is, if you say that, no, we were gerrymandering it for a political outcome, not a racial outcome, that will be permissible, even though it is essentially the same thing. The whole reason that they target voters by race is because they know they're actually getting at a partisan outcome. But now that renders it okay, which for, several decades previously was, no, that's why it's not okay. You can't do that. But now you can. Hooray. Well, let's see. Last year, a federal district court struck down the 1st District, ruling that Republicans had intentionally discriminated against black voters. A 3-judge panel concluded that legislators had violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause by packing too many black voters into the 6th District, illegally letting race predominate in the map-making process in the absence of any compelling government interest to do so. As shown on a map, which is here in length, the 1st District includes parts of the Charleston area and coastal South Carolina. There's an interactive version linked as well if you want to take a look at that. It saw multiple competitive elections under the previous decade's map. Democrat Joe Cunningham won in a 51-49 upset in 2018 before losing by that same margin to Mace in 2020. However, the GOP's new gerrymander, passed after the most recent census in 2020, insulated Mace from future challenges by extending Donald Trump's margin of victory from 52-46 to 53-45. Mace, in part thanks to this new map, comfortably won re-election 56-42 last year. Republicans took advantage of the fact that voting patterns in much of the South are heavily polarized along racial lines. Black voters overwhelmingly prefer Democrats, and white voters heavily favor Republicans. Map makers looking to protect Mace therefore moved black voters from her district into the 6th, a dark blue seat that already had a black majority and has long elected Representative Jim Clyburn, a black Democrat. But the Supreme Court, in an opinion authored by far-right Justice Samuel Alito, rejected as clearly erroneous the district court's determination that race had illegally predominated, departing, by the way, important point here, from a long-standing norm, and it's more than norm, it's judicial canon, of deference towards findings of fact by trial courts. In fact, appellate courts are not supposed to be considering issues of fact. They are supposed to accept as settled the fact finding in the courts below. It's the trial court where there's testimony given, where a jury can evaluate the veracity of that testimony, etc., that determines the facts, and appellate courts discuss whether or not the law was correctly applied to the facts. But the Supreme Court, being supreme, can do more or less whatever it wants, and decided that it was going to throw out the fact-finding work of the district court and throw out the appellate work done by the circuit court in evaluating the facts as determined in the district court, combined with their interpretation of the law, and throw it all out. So that was rather astonishing. So as Stephen says, they departed from a long-standing norm of deference toward findings of fact by trial courts. In doing so, Alito significantly increased the burden on plaintiffs to prove claims of illegal racial gerrymandering by holding that legislators draw maps with a presumption of good faith, which is amazing, especially considering the legal ethicists who presume good faith in Alito's excuses about upside-down flags outside of his house. Absent smoking gun evidence of intentional discrimination, as election law expert Rick Hasen put it, Alito's decision will require plaintiffs to produce an alternative map to show how map makers could achieve their partisan ends without illegally relying on race. This new requirement, found nowhere in legal precedent, consequently puts the burden on plaintiffs to help draw a new gerrymander for state officials, all but negating the purpose of filing a lawsuit in the first place. Not only will this ruling undermine the cause of black representation in South Carolina, it will likely reverberate far beyond the state. Alito's decision will blunt the ability of racial gerrymandering lawsuits to have a significant partisan impact, and because race and party are so heavily intertwined in the South, it diminishes the likelihood of increased representation for voters of color throughout the region. Yeah, it was pretty impactful. So, let's see. I have also available, as I mentioned, a piece from the election law blog about that, and I think it was relatively short, and we might be able to read through it pretty quickly. It comes directly from Rick Hasen, who writes, Justice Alito, for the Republican justices, over the dissent of Democratic justices, rewrites racial gerrymandering standards to help white Republican states. He puts it pretty bluntly, writes his own headlines, he does over there. In a 6-3 decision, authored by Alito, the Supreme Court has reversed a lower court ruling holding that South Carolina's congressional map was racial gerrymandering. Justice Thomas, by the way, concurred, and Justice Kagan, for the 3 liberal justices, dissented. The majority did something rare. It rejected the factual findings of the lower court, something the court is only supposed to do when those lower court findings are clearly erroneous. But because they're supreme, once again, they can do whatever they want. Thomas is mentioned here because he makes an even more outrageous concurrence. I wonder if it's discussed here. We'll see. This area of law is unduly complex. So, let me begin with the bottom line practical assessment of today's case before wading into the weeds. Yay, weeds. Justice Alito, for a court majority, has once again come up with a legal framework that makes it easier for Republican states to engage in redistricting to help white Republicans maximize their political power. He did so by reversing the burden of proof that should apply in these cases in 2 ways to favor these states, pushing a presumption of good faith and raising the evidentiary burdens for those challenging the maps. Once upon a time, racial gerrymandering claims were brought by white Republicans in the South to stop the creation of more districts in which minority voters could elect candidates of their choice. The U.S. Department of Justice was essentially forcing the states to draw these districts under DOJ's interpretation of the Voting Rights Act. The new racial gerrymandering cause of action, first recognized in Shaw versus Reno, made this harder to do. As the cause of action under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment emerged, it required proof that race was the predominant factor in drawing district lines and that there was no compelling reason, such as complying with the Voting Rights Act, to do so. I was and remain very critical of this cause of action because the harm is not a real one about vote dilution, but an expressive one that the state purportedly sends by dividing voters on the basis of race without adequate justification. Once DOJ stopped forcing southern states to draw more of these districts, These racial gerrymandering cases sort of disappeared. They reemerged about a decade ago when a bunch of southern states sought to pack and crack black voters in districts to maximize white Republican voting power in the South. Sometimes these states did so in a way that violated the anti-vote dilution provisions of the Voting Rights Act. But the standards are hard for plaintiffs to prove. And so when there was some vote dilution, but not enough to make a VRA claim, Black and Latino voters started bringing racial gerrymandering cases. And they won a bunch, including in Alabama, Virginia, and North Carolina. Of course, Alabama ignored it, and North Carolina elected a different Supreme Court and then reheard the case and decided, nah, we didn't, after all. By this decade, the racial gerrymandering cause of action had been repackaged as what Paul Clement once called junior varsity vote dilution claims. That is, they were not claims in which the plaintiff could prove VRA liability, but instead ones where it was enough to show lots of race consciousness in drawing district lines in ways that hurt minority interests. So, it is not surprising that Justice Alito, one of the justices most hostile to minority voting rights and voting rights claims more generally, pushed back. He dissented in Cooper versus Harris, a racial gerrymandering case written for the court by Justice Kagan. And today, he's turned his Cooper dissent into a majority opinion. The specific question in both cases is, how do you deal with a situation where race and party are highly correlated, and where partisan gerrymandering is allowed, but racial gerrymandering is not? I've, Rick Hazen says, written about this issue extensively in the Harvard Law Review Forum and William and Mary Law Review and Alabama Law Review and ACS Supreme Court Review. Trial courts must decide if race or party predominates, and that decision is subject to clear error review. That's the standard. In other words, unless there's clearly been an error in the fact finding, then the appellate courts are supposed to just accept what the trial court, which is closest to the testimony and evaluation of the testimony and the witnesses, etc., has decided. I believe that such an exercise is essentially impossible, but this is what courts have done for decades. As Justice Kagan explains in her dissent, Alito has turned things upside down when it comes to clear error review. Rather than defer heavily to the factual findings of the court, Alito doubles down on the presumption of good faith that he gives to the states when it comes to redistricting. It's a huge thumb on the scale, especially when coupled with the blessing he gives to partisan gerrymandering, which goes much further than the court did in a previous case, Rucho, which was more agnostic about the practice. Second, he says that without smoking gun evidence where legislators are talking about racial quotas or targets, plaintiffs need to produce alternative maps where there's the same partisan benefits of the map, but greater racial balance. This, of course, is hard to do when race and party is so correlated. Bottom line, now that these racial gerrymandering cases have been used to help minority plaintiffs, Alito is ready to shut them down. There's much to say, he says, about Justice Thomas's concurrence, too, which would hold that both racial gerrymandering and vote dilution claims are non-justiciable. But that will have to await future posts. We'll see what, I guess we could take a look and see whether he's gotten around to it or not. But, I don't know. Not yet, I don't think. But at any rate, yeah, apparently Thomas just thinks it's non-justiciable, period. That legislatures can draw the maps any way they want for any reason they want, and there's nothing the judges can do about it at any level. Because, why accrue power to yourself when you could just say, not my problem, I got to go on vacation and have a billionaire pay for it. I suppose that's a natural outcome for someone like Thomas. Okay, so let's see. On other subjects, just before our break is coming up, why don't I open up this one? Back to the Alito and flag thing, just for one slightly different take on it from Steve Vladek, who always has an interesting angle on things. This one he titles, Why Judicial Humility Matters. What's that all about? Well, hold on a second. The biggest issue, the subheader says, isn't the flags that the Alitos have flown outside their homes. It's that Justice Alito apparently doesn't think it's an issue in the first place. It's an interesting angle. Let's see. What have we here? As I previewed on Monday, he begins, this week's bonus issue takes something of a different look at the contretemps over the inverted U.S. flag that, as Jody Cantor broke in the New York Times last week, flew outside the home of Justice Alito in the run-up to President Biden's inauguration in 2021. Really, more in the wake of the insurrection than anything else. With the late edition of yesterday's reporting, I guess 2 days ago, by Cantor, Eric Toller, and Julie Tate about a second problematic flag that the Alitos flew outside their New Jersey beach house. A lot of folks have been quick to condemn the Alitos for their apparent support for the Stop the Steal movement, especially coming at such a late point, January 17th for the first flag and well into the Biden administration for the second, when it was clear that 1, Biden had won, and 2, there was no chance of Trump lawfully remaining in office. Many of those same critics have claimed that Justice Alito should have recused from at least some of the election-related cases still pending before the court at that point, and should recuse from the Trump immunity and January 6 obstruction cases now. I had something of a different reaction, he says. Although the substance of the Times' reporting and the Alito's behavior is profoundly alarming, I was struck even more by Justice Alito's first response to that reporting in a cryptic statement that he apparently provided to Cantor for the first story, and later, in an interview he apparently agreed to give to Fox News' Supreme Court correspondent Shannon Bream. Alito has not yet responded to yesterday's story, the Pine flag. In addition, or at least hadn't when he wrote this, in addition to throwing his wife, Martha Ann, under the bus, Alito's responses, 1, include justifications that can easily be and easily have been debunked, and 2, reflect zero recognition that anyone could reasonably be troubled by the flag flying outside of his house, and 3, highlight a much larger problem with at least some of the justice's behavior that isn't limited to Alito, the dangerous and growing contemporary lack of any judicial humility. What is it? What's it about? Well, that may have to wait, at least in part, until after the break. One more little bit here, though. Justices are humans. Humans make mistakes. Not only is it not the end of the world to acknowledge as much, if anything, candor and reflection on the justice's part might serve only to burnish the court's credibility these days. Let's come right back to this. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We continue with what I hope is a quick reading through Steve Vladek's interesting view from a different angle on the Alito flag controversy. He's concentrating not so much on what the flags are and what they mean, because it's subject to interpretation, but more on the, well, why aren't you avoiding the appearance of impropriety angle? Judicial humility. Does mention justices are human and they make mistakes, and it's not only not the end of the world to acknowledge as much. If anything, candor and reflection, he was saying, on the justice's part might serve only to burnish the court's credibility among those who aren't already sold on it or who have totally given up on it. But instead of either not responding at all to these stories or showing even a scintilla of contrition, Justice Alito chose to piss on us and tell us it's raining. We and the court, as an institution, deserve better. Well, it certainly deserve better than getting pissed on. So that's actually it. I know there was going to be a larger exposition on this, but apparently not. But good reminder that at a minimum, brings up the term of judicial humility. It's closely related to sort of the judicial demeanor that you sometimes hear about when there are people under review for confirmation to the Supreme Court. This person doesn't have the judicial demeanor, the judicial mindset, the ability to, recognize what it means to avoid the appearance, even the appearance of impropriety. An interesting and different angle on things, but I'm sure Vladek has more to say about it, but not for free, as he has a subscription Substack. So, all right, moving on from there. Let's see. There's, again, 10 other things I want to include in today's show, and not sure I can get to all of it. But why don't I start on one of the long reads that I had set aside and that I mentioned earlier in the week. Radley Balco needs your attention. on Trump's deportation army, which he writes in his Substack, The Watch. This is a lengthy piece, and we'll see how much of it we can get through. I don't really want to eat up the entirety of the rest of the show on this thing, but it is kind of an important thing. Delving into Trump's purported plans for, well, mass deportations if he were to, I don't want to make it as, I don't want to legitimize what's happening here. If he were to take power for whatever reason and through whatever mechanism, either following the November elections or, hell, anytime he feels like at this point, because what's the point anymore? We're forging electoral college certificates. Is he getting elected? I don't know. Does he get more votes? Doesn't matter. Does he get the electoral college? Who cares? Why wait till November? Why wait until votes are counted? Why do anything? You never know when this could happen. But if he were to seize power, if he were to try to actually deliver on this idiotic plan, if it is a plan, what would it actually look like? As I said, when I saw the article, I've been wondering just, logistically, 15 million immigrants that he feels he has the right to deport here. Just breaking it down to in the simplest terms, how many buses, how many drivers do we need, how many gallons of diesel fuel, where do we put people while they're waiting, et cetera? I mean, it's a logistics nightmare, which is why people, I guess, assume it will never happen. But as we've been instructed, you need to take him seriously, if not literally. And Radley Balco, among several people well qualified to take a look at this. Trump's deportation army, he writes. The subheader reading, the former president's vow to deport 15 million people is the cruelest, most illiberal, most openly authoritarian campaign promise in modern U.S. history. Oh, and it would also destroy the economy, in case you care about something like that. Oh, and also, by the way, something unified Reich. Okay, so here's the deal. Donald Trump wants to deport 15 million people. He has now made that promise on multiple occasions. He made similar promises during his first term, which, a lot of people say, well, he couldn't deliver on that either, so we don't care about this time. But this time's different for a number of reasons. Got an article on that, too, if you want to read about that. Anyway, he promised this in his first term when he said he'd deport 8 million people. Back then, he was thwarted by institutional resistance, other priorities, incompetence, I would add incontinence possibly as well, and his general tendency to get distracted. And he's a huge pervert. All right. Don't blame Balco for that one. That's just fact. But this time, there's a plan. It's not a smart plan. It's not an achievable one, but it is an unapologetically autocratic plan. You don't even try something like this unless you aspire to have an authoritarian government behind you. Lisa Sherman Luna, executive director of the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, told me, you're talking about soldiers marching through neighborhoods across the country, pulling families out of their homes. That's what it would take to get to the 15 million. The Atlantic, the New York Times, the Washington Post have all looked at what Trump and the MAGA coalition have planned for immigration policy should he be elected again, or just seize power. The stories all got some attention at the time, but not nearly enough to reflect the insanity of what he's proposing. Perhaps it's the sort of bluster Trump often spurts out at the moment, but never bothers to implement. We ought to take it more seriously. Trump has made 15 million deportations a central part of his 2024 campaign, and he's stepped up the dehumanizing of immigrants that he'll need to get a significant portion of the country on board. Even if Trump gets distracted, he'll likely put Stephen Miller in charge of the plan. Miller is the only non-relative senior staffer who served the entirety of the first Trump term, and Miller won't be distracted. Ridding the country of non-white immigrants has been a core part of his identity for his entire life. Miller himself has long made clear that the distinction that matters most to him is not between legal and illegal, but between white and non-white immigrants. Both prior to and after joining the Trump campaign in 2016 and the White House in 2017, Miller sent hundreds of emails to far-right outlets like Breitbart touting racist literature like Camp of the Saints. Don't know it, but you can look it up. And links to unabashed white nationalist sites where writers argue that non-white immigrants are of lower intelligence or are disease-ridden, parasitic, and predisposed to criminality. It shouldn't need saying, but immigrants and their children contribute far more to the economy than they take from it. are less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. Interracial IQ comparisons are based on a false premise and have few real-world implications. And provided there's some basic screening at the border, there's zero evidence that immigrants threaten public health. In November, Miller offered the details of his plan in an interview with Charlie Kirk, himself plenty racist, of course. Miller plans to bring in the National Guard, state and local police, and other federal police agencies like the DEA and ATF, if necessary. Just commandeer them. Here, different mission for you today. If necessary, the military. Miller's deportation force would then infiltrate cities and neighborhoods, going door to door and business to business in search of undocumented immigrants. He plans to house the millions of immigrants he wants to expel in tent camps along the border, and then use military planes to transport them back to their countries of origin. So that's the answer on the buses. It will take 0 buses, unless that's busing to get them to the camps, I suppose. Though he might have in mind boxcars. And still, even so, even worse, in fact, the transport planes, how many of those, what do we have? What does it take diesel fuel-wise? It doesn't take diesel fuel, the planes, but aviation fuel-wise, I guess. Plus, do you have that many tents? Does it matter? Does he care if they sleep outside? Probably not. But, what's the acreage you'll need to move that many people? He does. Believe me, there's no plan for any of that. And it doesn't matter because he doesn't plan to do it humanely either. Anyway, I hate to go all Godwin here. Radley Balco writes, but when you combine Miller's plan and personal history with Trump's recent rhetoric portraying immigrants as diseased, quote, animals, turned loose from foreign prisons and mental facilities who, quote, poison the blood of the country, or his ridiculous descriptions of migrants as, quote, military-aged, you could be forgiven for noticing that we're accumulating the necessary ingredients of a genocide. It certainly checks a lot of boxes. At the very least, they're creating the conditions for a mass humanitarian crisis. That's true, too. And I think this is one of the more excellent points, besides the logistics of it. I'm talking about the difficulty of the logistics of doing it on the assumption that you're not trying to just murder all those people. The logistics do change if you don't care whether some, most, or even all of those people die. Well, how much food do you need in order to do this humanely? Well, how about 0 so that you don't do it humanely and they all die? Or how many gallons of diesel fuel does it take to load them up on buses? Well, how much diesel fuel does it take for you to just march them to a cliff and push them all off? 0, right? The logistics that we might be thinking of are entirely different from the logistics they're thinking of. It's worth considering. Miller also wants to end birthright citizenship, more on that in a moment, and during the first Trump administration pushed a denaturalization program to strip naturalized immigrants of their citizenship. Remember, that's supposed to be the proudest moment for them in America, flag waving, this is how you do it right, etc. Well, screw you. We're going to take that away from you and push you off a cliff. Last year, a coalition of MAGA factions put together Project 2025, their blueprint for a second Trump term. And why even call it a term? Because he intends to stay in office forever. He's already talking about, when he talks about terms at all, he's talking about there should be a third, maybe even a fourth for me. It's basically a roadmap to autocracy, this Project 2025, and they make no secret of the fact that they want to do away with legal immigration and non-white legal immigration in particular. The Project 2025 plan would end the only legal way for seasonal and agricultural workers to come to the U.S. to work. It would also effectively end the H-1B visas that allow immigrants to work in fields like tech, engineering, and medicine, most of whom come from India or China. They want to end humanitarian programs that grant sanctuary for refugees fleeing war and other natural disasters, because we're going to cause one here. We don't want those people returned to us, I guess. And suspend all visas to any country that the administration deems uncooperative in accepting deportations. They want to screen visa applicants for ideology, barring entry and terminating the visas of people Miller considers politically impure. Miller told the New York Times that the administration would also invoke a 1798 law, he's Goodwill Hunting here, that allows federal officials to deport immigrants without due process during wartime, taking the broad view that drug cartels are waging a war against the United States. The Project 2025 plan also calls for cutting all federal aid to colleges and universities that provide financial aid to undocumented students, including DACA recipients, the undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children. It would cruelly tie all sorts of unrelated federal aid, including emergency aid after natural disasters, to state and municipal cooperation on immigration enforcement. Don't let us go door to door in your town. No federal aid for you in the case of an emergency. But you weren't going to get it anyway. So, the plan would require at least 70% of the staff of any federal contractor to be U.S. citizens, not legal residents, but U.S. citizens. As the Nikhasen Center put it, the mandate aims to demolish the American immigration system, coerce states and localities into cooperating with administrative schemes, and intimidate immigrants present in the United States. The deportation army that Miller and Trump want to assemble would be larger than any police force in the federal government, and if they got their way, would likely exceed the size of the U.S. Army itself. Unlikely to be able to fill those roles, unless they just simply say, because we can't, we just deputize you. If you got a MAGA hat, you can do whatever you want. That's an easier way of doing the logistics. And if you can't afford to round up immigrants and put them on buses and buy diesel fuel for them to get them to the camps, and you kill them instead, well, we just won't prosecute you, or we'll pardon you if someone else tries. That's one way of getting to it, I guess. It's beyond anything we've ever contemplated in this country, but so's forging electoral college certificates. I would remind you of that. It would be populated, this army, with Trump loyalists excited by the idea of breaking up families and dumping peaceful, undocumented people in countries they barely know, or shallow graves, whichever comes first. Trump approached the presidency like he ran his businesses, like a mob boss, that is. He thought the Justice Department should have been his personal law firm and has vowed to weaponize it against his opponents should he win again. It isn't at all difficult to imagine how, once in place, this deportation force might be used to enforce Trump's other authoritarian impulses and campaign promises like infiltrating blue cities to, quote, fight crime, arrest homeless people, or to beat and possibly shoot people who stage protests against his policies. Deporting even a fraction of 15 million people would also, by the way, wreck the economy. Inflation would soar, especially when combined with Trump's plan to slap a 10% across-the-board tariff on imports, and the U.S. would likely spiral into a recession, possibly a depression. Naturally, House Speaker Mike Johnson has expressed his enthusiastic support. Trump and Miller aren't going to deport 15 million people in 4 years. It's just not possible. But the important thing, the thing that ought to be immediately disqualifying, is that they plan to try. And again, I have to remind you, no, they aren't going to be able to deport 15 million people in 4 years. Could they murder a significant portion of them? Could they intern them in camps and never get around to deporting them? Yeah. You could try and fail in spectacular fashion to deport them all. And if you don't mind killing them, then I guess you're happy with the outcome. And, what are we supposed to do? They've murdered 10 million people. Aha, well, you said you would deport them and you failed to do so. That's not really going to be the argument at that point. All right. What about the logistics? Depending on which rally or interview you consult, Trump has put his deportation goal somewhere between 15 and 20 million people. It's now up because a couple million more every estimation, and he doesn't care. It doesn't matter to him that it was logistically impossible the first time. The Pew Foundation estimates that there are about 10 million undocumented people in the United States. The Department of Homeland Security puts the figure at about 11 million. The far-right Center for Immigration Studies puts the high end around 14 million. This means that already Trump is promising to deport more people than there are undocumented immigrants in the country. You don't care about that. Which means he's promising to deport between 1 and 6 million people who are legal residents or U.S. citizens. Maybe. Or he's just exaggerating the numbers. No one knows. No one knows. It's pretty clear that the distinction matters very little to them. This passage from the Washington Post piece last February didn't quite get as much attention as other components of the plan, but it really hammers home the fact that Trump plans to ignore what the law and the Constitution say about citizenship. And here's the passage they use. The Trump campaign has also said it would sign an executive order on his first day in office to withhold passports, social security numbers, and other government benefits from children of undocumented immigrants born in the United States. Now, children of undocumented immigrants are U.S. citizens currently. It's enshrined in the 14th Amendment. But, they erased part of that the other week anyway. So what good is that? We live in a surreal political moment, one in which the absurdity of the latest thing can quickly get lost in the absurdity of all the other things. But this is worth some added emphasis. Or emphasis, if you prefer. The man currently favored to be the next president, according to the polls, which are wrong, is promising to unilaterally and illegally strip 4 million people of their citizenship. I asked several immigration experts what it would take to deport 15 million people. That figure is twice the population of New York City, by the way. It's, in fact, about the size of the 3 largest U.S. cities combined, New York, L.A., and Chicago, plus Pittsburgh. A state of 15 million people would be the 5th most populous in the country, ahead of Pennsylvania and only behind California, Texas, New York, and Florida. The pre-World War II Jewish population of Europe, including the Soviet Union, was about 9 million. So just in terms of transporting people, we're looking at an operation that would need to be 2/3 larger than the Nazi transport of Jews during the Holocaust, if they'd managed to get every Jewish person on the continent. The Trump immigration plan would be the second largest forced displacement of human beings in human history, on a par with Britain's disastrous partition of India, and second only to a total forced displacement during World War II. What would it cost? Well, who cares, right? In 2017, ICE estimated that it cost an average of $10,854 to deport one person, or about $14,000 for today's money. Under this calculation, Trump's plan to deport 15 million people would cost about $210 billion, or about 14% more than the annual budget of the U.S. Army. Okay, good for making the point of how ridiculous it is, but it doesn't cost near that much to simply murder those people. Though it does cost money to round them up and find the weaponry to kill them and then use it. But this estimate is almost certainly too low. Under current U.S. policy, undocumented people are typically only deported if they've been arrested, convicted of crimes, or come into contact with the criminal justice system in some other way. ICE keeps a database of people it wants to deport, generally people who have criminal records or have been deported in the past. When cooperating police agencies arrest someone in the database, they're held and handed over to ICE for deportation. Trump's plan would require deportation officials to go into cities, workplaces, colleges, and neighborhoods, find undocumented immigrants, and forcibly extract them. He did some of this during his first term, but it was sporadic and mostly for show. This would be on a much, much larger scale. These will be people who, for the most part, are indistinguishable from legal residents and citizens, and whose only offense is to be in the country without documentation, which is a civil offense, not a criminal one. That means it's a near certainty that a significant number of people who are here legally would be mistakenly detained. Some would be deported, and once they're gone, they'd have to battle a backlogged and bureaucratic morass of an immigration system to get back in. Usually, refugee crises are brought on by large groups of people either voluntarily migrating from regions struck by war or natural disaster, or armies forcibly moving people en masse. Trump's deportation plan would mean identifying the undocumented people in virtually every decent-sized city, town, and county in the United States, detaining those people in some regional facility, transporting them to a bus station or airport, then flying, walking, or driving them across the border. Imagine what it would take to evacuate the entirety of New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. Imagine the number of buses you'd need, the number of holding facilities, and everything you'd need to staff and equip those facilities. You'd need security. You'd need medical staff. You'd need food services. You'd need bathroom and shower facilities. You'd need janitorial staffs, bus drivers, and pilots. Unless all you needed was grave diggers. I have to point that out. Now, imagine moving, and why bother burying them? Just get some heavy earth-moving equipment. That'll take care of it. Now imagine moving a population equal in size to the populations of those cities, but spread out all over the United States. In addition to Miller's tent encampments along the border, you'd also need detainment facilities in every major city to hold immigrants as they await transport. Sanctuary cities would resist letting the administration use space in their jails, but even in cooperating jurisdictions, there wouldn't be nearly enough available space. In his Atlantic piece, Brownstein consulted with experts who made the dystopian suggestion of housing immigrants in warehouses and abandoned shopping malls. And by the way, look out for your first substantive Third Amendment violations along the way. Currently, removals are handled by the Enforcement and Removals Operation, or ERO, Division of ICE. I didn't even realize there was an acronym for that. At the moment, that office has 7,600 employees. Last year, ERO removed about 142,000 people with a budget of $4.7 billion. If we apply those numbers to Trump's 15 million plan and spread it out over a 4-year term, Trump would need the ERO or an equivalent agency to increase its capacity by a factor of about 26. So the office would need to increase to more than 200,000 employees and a budget of $122 billion. But that's just the muscle, or the people who carry out the removals. ICE has also got investigators, administrative staff, attorneys who argue immigration cases in court. Well, there wouldn't be any of those. Overall, ICE has about 20,000 employees with a budget of $8.5 billion. If we assume the current staffing and budget would need to expand at a scale with the number of removals, Trump's deportation plan would need 530,000 employees. That's about 70,000 more staff than all the current active duty troops in the U.S. Army. Maybe just use them then. No more defending the United States interests anywhere in the world. Sorry, we're going to do this instead. The overall ICE budget would need to increase to $225 billion, 80% more than the current budget for the entire Department of Homeland Security, and 20% more than the Army's 2025 budget. You'd also need to multiply the number of immigration courts. Don't give them any due process. And judges, of course. Currently, there are 69 immigration courts with 650 immigration judges. To keep the current ratio, do you care? You need 1,800 more courts, over 17,000 judges, $981 million, an increase is the current budget. I would have to be up to $26 billion. Sure. These are rough estimates, of course. Some ICE removals are done in conjunction with other agencies like Border Patrol, and it's at least possible that current ICE agents could be arresting, detaining, and deporting more people than they currently do. Economies of scale would likely reduce the overall cost, but only to a point. You'd quickly start to hit capacity limits. You can only cram so many new beds into detention centers before you need to build or co-opt more facilities, or just stack people on top of one another until they die. You can only cram so many new hearings into already overscheduled courtrooms before you'll need to find or build new courtrooms. As of January, federal immigration courts were already working with a backlog of 3 million cases. Adding millions more would likely grind the system to a halt, but F the system. But that's just the beginning of the detainment problem. Trump also wants to end catch and release, as they call it, the process of releasing migrants and undocumented immigrants while their cases are pending. As is often the case, Trump's criticism here is based on a lie. The overwhelming majority of immigrants, 83%, released under this policy, do return for their hearings. Currently, Congress has budgeted $3.4 billion to detain about 41,500 migrants per day. If Trump were to merely detain everyone whose case is currently backlogged in the immigration courts, the federal government would need to increase capacity from 41,500 to 3 million. That's about 3 times the population of every state and federal prison in the country. According to the Cato Institute's David Beyer, or Beer, if you pronounce it in the German style, B-I-E-R, Beer, adding just 1.5 million new beds would come in at the rate of about $129 billion per year, or 16 times ICE's total annual budget. Under Trump's plan, you'd need to double that figure just to accommodate the current backlog. House Speaker Johnson would need to find an additional $258 billion, or about twice the annual budget of the state of Florida, just to detain the current backlog. You getting the idea here? The Trump administration tried to solve this problem by forcing migrants to remain in Mexico while their cases are processed, a policy that's inhumane, hasn't prevented more migrants, and has even proven impossible to implement at scale. And as I'll discuss in a moment, if we permit him to do so after the break, it's that policy that'll probably be impossible in a second Trump administration as well. Okay. Now, one more paragraph perhaps before we get out of here. Currently, it costs the federal government about $165 to detain one undocumented immigrant for 1 day. It costs significantly more to detain families, which would comprise a large percentage of new deportees under Trump's plan. The average deportation process can take anywhere from a few weeks to a few years, but the current backlog is prolonging that process. So you can see, all right, the logistics obviously becoming quickly impossible. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We got a little bit of a laptop pinwheel of death problem here, so we're going to have to switch screens and scroll down and try and find our place once again in this lengthy Radley Balco piece here. We got to figure out where we were in all of this. Let's see, we read through this. Were there title hang on? There's David Beer. So I think we made it down to about here. Right. Let's see. Oh, right. We had just read that the average deportation process can take anywhere from a few weeks to a few years, but the current backlog is prolonging that process. It also takes significantly longer if the person has been in the country for a long period of time, which are precisely the people Trump's plan would need to target. It also takes longer if the person's home country won't take them back. And of course, suddenly overwhelming the system with a flood of new cases will only make the typical case take longer to resolve, which means yet more time in detention. There would also be significant transportation costs. Mexican immigrants are generally deported by walking or driving them across the border, but deportations to most other countries requires a flight. Yes, sensible, worth pointing out, but that's only under the current rules when we're actually trying to deport people, as opposed to, we don't care where they're from. It doesn't matter if they're from India, China, whatever. We're going to dump them all in Mexico and make it Mexico's problem. Or we're not going to deport them at all. We're going to push them out of cargo planes on our flights to wherever. We're just flying over the ocean like Chile used to do and chucking them out the window. Okay, just once again, I got to remind you of this along the way. It's interesting, but like the Pepe the Frog types will be pointing and laughing and saying, "Ha! You all thought this would cost a fortune," when it's actually quite thrifty. I mean, it still costs a lot of money to pull off all these murders, but whatever. Anyway, I don't think money is the issue for all these guys. There would be significant transportation costs. Yes, Beer says the federal government currently runs about 100 to 150 removal flights per month, with around 150 deportees on each flight. These would need to be ramped up significantly. In 2016, the Orwellian named Ice Air flew 110,000 deportees overseas at a cost of about $2,600 of today's dollars each. If we assume the proportion of deportees who need to be flown back remains about the same, we're looking at another $2 billion or so per year for those flights alone. Okay, look, the pinwheel's gone. Now I can go back to the other screen and dedicate this screen to the actual running of the show. So, Miller mapped out this part of the plan in his interview with Charlie Kirk. Let's see what he has to say about this one. So if you build these facilities, then you're able to say, hypothetically, 3 times a day are the flights back to Mexico. 2 times a day are the flights back to the Northern Triangle, right? On Monday and Friday are the flights back to different African countries, right? On Thursday and Sunday are the flights back to different Asian countries. So you create this efficiency by having these standing facilities where planes are moving off the runway constantly, probably military aircraft, some existing DHS assets, and that's how you're able to scale and achieve the efficiency. It's not. But, of course, if they're military cargo planes, you can just, like I said, open up that back door and tilt the plane and just dump everybody out of it. I guess that's their plan. Miller's plan for the efficient mass removal of human beings will hit a snag when more countries stop accepting deportees. Yeah, see, Radley still thinks they're going to land those planes in other countries, but I don't think so. But what else is he going to assume? He can't just simply write that they're planning mass murder because, that's not what the plan says. So you got to evaluate what they're saying. But I'm telling you how they manage the impossibility of this thing. Miller's plan for the efficient mass removal of human beings will hit a snag when more countries stop accepting deportees. This is already the case with hostile governments like those in Venezuela and Cuba. For deportations to those countries, the U.S. government often sends people back with a one-way commercial ticket. The federal government did this about 6,100 times in 2016. Those flights are much more expensive. The list of countries refusing deportees will almost certainly grow. Some will refuse in protest of the deportation policy itself, which in addition to all the other damaging consequences means fewer remittances back into their economies. Others might reject deportees in retaliation for other hostile Trump policies, or perhaps just because he's fond of calling them, S-hole countries. It seems likely, for example, that the Mexican government will be considerably less cooperative on immigration and asylum seekers, including the Remain in Mexico policy, once Trump starts bombing that country with drones, as he's also announced he wants to do. At best, less cooperation from countries of origin would mean more expensive, surreptitious deportations through commercial airlines. But you can't just start flying hundreds of thousands of deportees on commercial airlines. So we'll likely end up with a much worse scenario. Hundreds of thousands of people in Miller's tent camps awaiting deportation and nowhere to send them. The immigration experts I spoke to fear that the Trump administration could respond by creating a sort of Guantanamo Bay for deportees, or dump them in whatever country is willing to take them, likely a developing country, compensated with lots of foreign aid. The UK just passed a controversial new law sending asylum seekers to Rwanda while their cases are adjudicated. But and remember, that's no matter where they're from. But even that policy is expected to top out at about 50,000 people. This would be hundreds of thousands. How would they do it? How does Hope Hicks do it? I don't know. How would they do it? That's the next section. Let's see. So how would Trump get an additional 530,000 immigration enforcement officers? Miller had a few suggestions. First, he has mentioned the National Guard. Specifically, Miller says Republican governors could activate Guard reservists to carry out the plan. They have to want to show up, of course. I mean, at this point, the whole government is collapsing. Like, if you don't feel like doing the work, don't show. And that's okay. They'll deputize MAGA people. I don't know whether they'll ever discuss that, though. He's probably right that most Republican governors would oblige. As of now, 14 Republican governors have sent Guard troops to the border at the request of Texas Governor Greg Abbott. Currently, the Guard has 325,000 reservists. Let's assume that half are in states with Republican governors. That's about 162,500 troops, assuming Trump could get all of them. He'd still be far short of what he needs. In fact, even if half the National Guard reservists, all 20,000 ICE agents, all 21,000 Border Patrol officers, all 37,000 FBI agents, all 5,000 DEA agents, all 2,600 ATF agents, and all 10,000 Homeland Security investigations agents were all tasked with rounding up undocumented immigrants full-time, Trump would still be about 282,000 enforcement agents short. Which, of course, brings us to NCIS. They'll take care of it. They punch above their weight. So they can each take care of 10 million immigrants apiece. I don't know. Trump and Miller have also suggested they could get help from state, local, and county police. There are major constitutional problems with that. But who cares? F the Constitution. But yeah, technically speaking, major constitutional problems with asking state and local police to enforce federal immigration law. That issue is currently working its way through the courts, so to hell with that. They'll get rid of those problems. But that's just an issue with states, cities, and police agencies who want to cooperate. The highest concentrations of undocumented immigrants reside in sanctuary cities, where city and police leaders either have no interest in enforcing immigration law, are prohibited from doing so by local law, or both. But to hell with all of that as well. It also seems likely that once Trump's immigration hunters begin their work, we'll see more immigrants moving to sanctuary cities. Maybe that's what they're after. Trump and Miller also want to punish uncooperative cities and states by withholding federal funding. That dispute will inevitably be resolved by the federal courts. Maybe not in their favor. Until then, it seems likely, or unlikely rather, that they'll be able to compel blue cities and states to use their own resources to hunt down undocumented immigrants. The more likely scenario would be for Trump to federally deputize state and local police officers who want to participate and send National Guard troops from red states into blue cities in those states. This would mean sending a bunch of sheriff's deputies from, say, rural Texas, and there aren't that many, into Houston, Austin, or El Paso, or from, say, Indiana into Chicago, with vague orders to detain and arrest anyone who looks, quote, illegal. Yeah, I guess that would be the plan. Now, mind you, most of those people say they're afraid to go to cities. Now, they're afraid to go unarmed anyway, but sometimes even armed, they're afraid to go. So it's going to be an enormous expense for all these guys to buy all their body armor and semi-automatic weaponry, etc., some of which they already own. But I don't know how many volunteers you're going to get to go into these places. Anyway, here's Miller describing the plan to Charlie Kirk on the podcast. We saw under President Trump how elated ICE was when, on one day, we said, you can arrest whoever you want to arrest. Did they say that? They may have. All the memos, all the restrictions, all the restraints are gone. I don't know if they ever actually did that. If they did that, then what are we even worried about? Why are we even wondering how they can do it? They'll just do it again. Go out, make arrests. No one's going to tell you not to put cuffs on somebody and send them home. Border Patrol was elated when we said all this asylum BS ends. It ends now. These fake stories, these fake families, these fake asylum claims, it all stops now. They were ecstatic when that happened. And so they will be equally ecstatic when it comes time to implement the next phase of the plan, God willing, in 2025. Obviously, there's a lot of work that has to be done between now and then, but I want everybody listening, he said, to understand that this is going to happen. If President Trump is back in the Oval Office in January, this is going to commence immediately, and it will be joyous, and it will be wonderful, and it will be everything you want it to be. Well, at least he's paving the way. Now I know what to do in January of 2025. If that's not the case and he doesn't seize power and Joe Biden is in office, go arrest Trump supporters. Arrest whoever you want. It's okay. No rules. Just right. It'll be just like taking him to Outback Steakhouse. Round him up and toss him into the ocean. It's legal. It's what they wanted. They just didn't realize that the leopards were going to eat their faces. Well, I would say, see how they like it, but I don't care, and I'll never find out because they'll be in the ocean. What a great plan this is. Well, I just think it's mistargeted. Anyway, that last line, in case it didn't strike you, is really depraved, Radley says. Yeah, that's true. It would be wonderful and joyous and everything you want it to be. Opposing undocumented immigration is one thing. Finding joy and glee at armed enforcers pulling people from their homes, cramming them into camps, and dumping them off in countries they barely know is diabolical. The problem for Miller is that they won't find enough cops to make this happen either. Estimates on the number of active duty law enforcement officers in the United States vary widely, but at the high end, it's around 700,000 sworn officers. This means that without support from the National Guard, Trump would need about 70% of those officers working full-time on immigration. Even if he were somehow to muster 100% participation from all National Guard troops in red and blue states, he'd still need about 30% of police manpower nationwide. And of course, those resources would be diverted from other police work. It seems likely that the administration would also ask Congress for funding to go on a hiring binge. They wouldn't get nearly what they'd need to deport 15 million people, but they'd likely get a substantial increase, and they'd use it to hire Trump-loyal ICE and Border Patrol agents who are excited at the possibility of pulling families out of their homes and putting them on airplanes, and then putting them back out of them again, I would add. Border Patrol is by far the most feverishly pro-MAGA police agency in the federal government, and it's likely that the typical CBP officers would likely be the archetype for new hires into Trump's deportation army. Again, it's the aspiration that's chilling. If he were able to hire the number of people he'd actually need, Trump's deportation force would be larger than any branch of the U.S. military, even Space Force. If it were a military itself, it would be the 8th largest in the world. But even these figures may be low because we're extrapolating from current removal figures under current removal policy. Again, current U.S. policy prioritizes deporting undocumented people who are already determined to be a threat to public safety, people who have been arrested or convicted of crimes or did something else to put themselves on the radar of immigration officials. It's usually just a matter of handing them off. Trump's plan would require immigration officials, police, National Guardsmen, local cops, and whomever else he assigns to the operation to seek out undocumented immigrants, whose only offense is to be undocumented. That sort of operation requires considerably more manpower and resources. When they have to track down a fugitive, they don't send just one guy, Beers says. They send 4- and 5-man teams, and that's what they'd have to do when they start pursuing people who aren't already in custody. There is a darker, and unfortunately I think more likely scenario in which the cost of Trump's plan would be quite a bit lower than the figures above. As cruel and inhumane as our current immigration system is, it's pretty damned cruel and inhumane, by the way. It does have protocols, rules, and procedures. Here's Balco getting around to my point the whole time. He was going to get there. He knows what's going on. There are still at least some protections for the people who come into this country without documentation. If there's one thing we've learned from the reporting on Project 2025, it's that they have no intention of letting laws, rules, or procedures get in their way. The plan for a Trump 2 administration is to purge anyone who cares about norms and institutions, even if they're otherwise hardcore conservatives. The only real requirement in the new administration will be loyalty to Trump. It's notable that Miller at one point told Kirk, federal law enforcement has been populated by many people who range from Democrat partisan to wild-eyed left-wing radical. The notion that federal law enforcement agencies are populated with woke leftists is, of course, delusional. By wild-eyed left-wing radical, Miller means anyone who, for any given order, might prioritize the rule of law over Trump. But remember, you need every person you can get in order to make any of this work. You lose any of them to ideology, and you're back to the drawing board. Kirk then asked Miller how they plan to get around the immigration lawyers, by which he means people at INS and DOJ who insist on abiding by the law. Miller responded, well, that's where President Trump has proven so adept. A lot of people don't realize the depth and extent of what was achieved in the first term. By 2020, we completely shut down access to the U.S. asylum system. Everybody was expelled without any ability to apply for asylum in the United States, and we were able to build that architecture under President Trump's leadership by developing rock-solid legal strategies, agency records, putting the right people and personnel in place. That's the quote. Now, Balco, the goal will be to deport as many people as possible as quickly as possible and purge anyone who tries to slow it down. Sticklers for legal restrictions or basic human rights will be quickly dismissed. If it costs too much or becomes impractical to house and transport detained immigrants humanely, they'll do it inhumanely. If it costs too much to afford them basic due process rights, they'll ignore due process. If the immigration courts are moving too slowly, or if there just aren't enough of them, they'll just go around the courts. After all, once a desperate, impoverished person is deported back to their home country, or any other country, or the ocean, it's all but impossible to sue their way back in. Note that for all the logistical needs Miller mentions in his interview with Kirk, procuring planes from the Pentagon, setting up camps on federal land, deputizing local law enforcement, he doesn't mention the need to staff up the immigration courts. I doubt it's because he hasn't thought about it. As for all the pain, suffering, and death that will inevitably result from this plan, for Miller, those aren't bugs, they're features. Recall that the entire point of child separation, a policy for which Miller was a key architect, was deterrence. The idea was to create scenes of emotional devastation, of migrant children being ripped from their arms of their parents so other migrants would stay home. Of course, that isn't what happened. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that a Trump II administration would see overcrowded, unsanitary camps plagued by cholera or diphtheria as a plus. And by the way, cholera and diphtheria, famously respectful of chain link fencing, definitely won't pass through and enter our population. Anyway, that all is for them just another deterrent. Trump has already conditioned his supporters to think of undocumented people as vermin. Once you've convinced people that migrants are animals, it isn't much of a leap to start housing and transporting them as you would sheep or cattle. And it's a lot cheaper. It would probably also provide plenty of B-roll that Trump and right-wing media could use. And they could use immigrants to reinforce their demagogic claims that immigrants are infested with disease. Miller and other immigration hawks are fond of citing the epithetically named Operation Wetback as their model. This was, of course, the lawless, militaristic deportation program carried out by the Eisenhower administration that decent people view as a stain on U.S. history. Mexican immigrants were rounded up, stuffed into buses, ships, and planes, and dropped off in remote parts of Mexico, regardless of from which part of the country they'd emigrated, if they had at all. Dozens died in the heat. Others died of disease or abuse during their removal. The operation also ensnared thousands of U.S. citizens and legal residents who happened to be Latino. The Eisenhower administration claimed to have deported 1.1 million people through this program. Historians have put the number of deportations closer to 250,000. Much of the rest of the 1.1 million were people who voluntarily returned when the administration cut backroom deals with large employers of immigrants to let them bring Mexican workers in legally through the Bracero program if they then fired those who were here illegally. That isn't going to be an option this time because Miller and the Project 2025 coalition plan to end the only legal way for migrant workers to immigrate legally. Side note here, Harlan Carter, Eisenhower's head of INS, who oversaw the deportations, was once convicted of murdering a Mexican boy when he was 17. Carter pled self-defense, and the verdict was overturned due to faulty jury instructions. The charge was later dropped. Carter would go on to lead the National Rifle Association instead. What do you know about that? So, even the notoriously brutal civil liberties trampling mass deportation that Miller and other immigration hawks recall so fondly only removed between 2 and 5% of the immigrants Trump wants to deport. So, could they do it? I think we've established that logistics and the laws of physics will prevent Trump from deporting 15 million people, but how much of this could they get away with and for how long? The Supreme Court gives the executive branch enormous latitude when it comes to setting and enforcing immigration policy. The court has all but suspended the Fourth Amendment for immigration enforcement within 100 miles of the border, a zone that includes about 2/3 of the U.S. population. In terms of Fourth Amendment, meaning, I guess, the various search and seizure and due process procedures. Basically, you have a lot less rights in the border zone if they think they've got you. The court has also been deferential to the executive with respect to national security, including when it comes to determining what is and isn't related to national security at all. There's a reason why Trump and the Republicans keep calling migrants invaders. They can then invoke national security law. The court threw out multiple lawsuits from innocent people who were detained, beaten, and tortured after the September 11th attacks, conferring immunity on both the political leaders who issued the orders and the soldiers, CIA officers, and others who carried them out. As for federalizing National Guard troops for immigration purposes in blue states against the wishes of their governors, in this piece for The Atlantic, linked here, Ron Brownstein consulted with legal authorities who seem to think the courts probably wouldn't allow that. Well, you never know. Miller seems aware of this, which is why he told Kirk that the plan would be to send Guard troops from red states into blue states to round up immigrants. And if you're going to go into an unfriendly state like Maryland, well, there would just be Virginia doing the arrest in Maryland, right? Very close, very nearby. Virginia actually more of a blue state than you think anyway, but red governor, so maybe. Brownstein's piece suggests that the court probably would frown on this too, but he also points out that Trump could potentially get around this problem invoking the Insurrection Act and bringing in active duty military. Trump desperately wanted to invoke the law during George Floyd protests. He was thwarted when defense and national security officials threatened to resign. It seems safe to say that this time Trump will surround himself with people who have no such principles. As for the legality of other components of Miller's plans, birthright citizenship is enshrined in the 14th Amendment, but who cares? And I doubt even the Fifth Circuit would have the audacity to claim otherwise. Well, I think he probably would be rethinking that now. And in 2017, the Supreme Court thoroughly rebuked the federal government's efforts to denaturalize someone based on an alleged lie in the application process. That sent a pretty clear message that you need to show outright fraud to strip someone of citizenship. That said, there's also the question of whether a Trump 2 administration would bother to abide by court rulings. Birthright citizenship, for example, isn't up for debate. It's explicitly prescribed in the Constitution. They plan to revoke it anyway, which certainly suggests that they aren't particularly worried about what the courts may do. Given Trump's history of trying to delegitimize every court that defies him, it isn't difficult to imagine a Trump 2 administration provoking a constitutional crisis by openly ignoring court rulings. But it wouldn't even need to come to that. They could do what Trump did the first time around and what he's doing now in his personal legal troubles. They could start implementing clearly illegal policies and mass violations of civil rights under transparently BS legal theories, then just continue doing the illegal stuff when those cases take months or years to work their way through the courts. The Supreme Court almost always assumes good faith. We just did it again. On the part of the people in power, so you could just put someone like Jeffrey Clark at the Office of Legal Counsel and later say you were earnestly relying on the legal opinions of that esteemed office. The Roberts Court also seems to believe that the best way to protect the integrity of the court is to avoid confrontation with the executive. So even if the court eventually hems and haws its way to overturning illegal policy, you can do a lot of damage in the meantime. Miller and his cohorts would also have little to fear personally. Again, the post-September 11th decisions largely insulated the politicians who make and implement federal policies from any civil liability. If the architects of Guantanamo and the CIA torture program can't be sued, it's hard to envision the court finding room to sue Miller for setting up cholera camps or looking the other way while Latino legal residents or U.S. citizens were mistakenly deported. Moreover, after Egbert versus Bull, if I've got those names right, in 2022, individual federal law enforcement officers now essentially have absolute immunity from civil liability too, even for egregious, clearly intentional constitutional violations. Now we're in Radley Balco's real wheelhouse. The federal courts have also ruled that local police deputized as federal officers enjoy the same protections. So, any Guard reservists, local cops, U.S. troops, or Proud Boys absorbed into Trump's deportation force would be protected too. I don't think the latter is an exaggeration. Trump has long had a twisted fascination with rogue groups of bikers, cops, and soldiers using violence against his enemies. It's not at all difficult to see him trying to deputize militia groups and Minuteman types to help with deportations. There's currently a fairly substantial training and certification process for deputizing immigration officials, but a Trump administration could try to waive all of that. So, in sum, we'd have a deportation army working for a DHS or DOJ staffed with Trump loyalists who don't believe in birthright citizenship, don't believe that even naturalized citizens are real citizens, and who, like Trump, believe Immigration enforcement officers should be unleashed from the constraints that come with respecting the rights of the people they detain, and if they should illegally beat or shoot someone or mistakenly deport a U.S. citizen or legal resident, Trump's DOJ won't prosecute them. That's got a little asterisk. We'll get to that in a second. And they can't be sued. Every incentive nudges them toward cruelty, exuberance, and erring on the side of arrest, and there's really no disincentive for going too far. What was that asterisk? The federal courts have thrown out attempts by state prosecutors to criminally charge federal law enforcement officers under state law. So there's that. Finally, on some level, the could they do it question seems irrelevant. This is the most illiberal, openly authoritarian campaign promise from a major presidential candidate in my lifetime. They want to do it. They're promising to do it. They have a plan in place to do it. Letting them try is putting the principles of democracy on black and spinning a roulette wheel. Only there's no payoff if we're lucky enough to win. We can only lose. One last section, and shall we extend things just a little bit to get a little bit of the damage? When Trump talks about undocumented immigrants, he unambiguously moves between the handful and disproportionately small population who commit crimes while they're here and peaceful undocumented immigrants. But his plan is to deport all of them, and here's what that would mean. According to we're not going to be able to make it all through this, but according to the Center for Migration Studies, under Trump's plan, around 5.7 million U.S.-born U.S. citizen children would lose one or both parents. If just 1/3 of those children remain in the U.S., the public cost of their care would be around $118 billion. Though, of course, if Trump and Miller get their way, those kids would also either be deported or denied access to the social safety net programs. 3 million undocumented people who were children when they were brought into the U.S. would be deported and dropped off in countries they'd never known. Tens of thousands of mixed-status families would be plunged into poverty. The average annual income of households with at least one undocumented family member would drop from $41,000 a year to $23,000. The plan would also put more than 1 million mortgages in jeopardy, destabilizing the housing market, by the way. Back in 2017, when Trump said he wanted to deport a mere 8 million immigrants, the center-right think tank American Action Forum estimated that the removal itself and the border security needed to carry it out would cost about $500 billion. And if we adjust for inflation, forget about it. Man, there's more, but we can't make it all the way through, as you can tell. It's time for us to get out of here. Spend the weekend reading over some of this. Spend the weekend reading over the very interesting profiles of RFK Jr.'s vice presidential pick, Nicole Shanahan, which we could have spent an entire show with. Read about all sorts. I've got lots to get back to. It's making it almost impossible to think about taking Monday off, but we may manage to do it anyway.
From networksradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
All right, well, we're way late for turning things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, but as you know, he's got a collection of stories. There's a million things that we didn't get to, and he's got a lot of them. For instance, North Carolina residents filed suit to remove a Confederate monument dedicated to our faithful slaves. Interesting. Mixed feelings about that one, right? Let's find out more next.